Now, though, onto something much more serious. James Bulger's evil killer made bid for freedom today in a behind-closed-doors parole hearing. A two-day appeal will determine whether Jon Venables can be released from jail after he was locked up for possessing sick child abuse images.
James Bulger would have been 33 in March, but when he was just 2 years old, he was snatched from the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle by two 10-year-olds, Jon Venables and Robert Thompson, who tortured and murdered him on a railway line. In November 1993, Venables and Thompson became the youngest convicted murderers in British history. The pair were handed indefinite life sentences, but 8 years later, in 2001, they were released on licence with new identities. Thompson has never reoffended, but Venables has been sent back to prison twice, having been caught with images of child abuse on his computer, as well as a paedophile manual. He was convicted in 2017 after admitting to possessing more than 1,100 illegal pictures or photos, including those showing the abuse of male toddlers. Venables was refused parole in 2020. This latest hearing will be held in private by a three-person panel. If released, he will yet again have a chance at freedom with a new identity. But speaking exclusively to Talk Today last month, James Bulger's father Ralph broke down as he begged the parole board to keep Venables in jail.
What would give you some semblance of peace?
Just keep him in. I think you've got to do everything you can to try and keep him behind bars, because he's been a danger from day one. He's reoffended. To me, I think he enjoys what he's doing, and he's a ticking time bomb just waiting to go off, in my opinion.
To discuss this, I'm joined by criminal barrister James Oliveira Agnew. James, very good evening to you. Welcome to the Independent Republic here at TalkTV. Terribly emotional interview there with James Bulger's father, and he said, of course, what you would expect him to say. I think a lot of people I talk to find it astonishing that the parole board would even ever consider parole for such an individual, but particularly after being released twice before. It's pretty ridiculous, isn't it, that he's now up for a third time?
Good evening. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. Of course, I think everyone of my generation, everyone of that age remembers this case vividly, and it's just that little clip you showed there is a horrible, horrible thing to watch. Of course, the parole board is an independent body. They have to be independent. They can't be coerced by governments or by MPs or secretaries of state or anything of that nature. And they follow a set guideline set down by governments that gives them the framework they have to operate in. And of course, one of those frameworks is that he's entitled to make this parole appeal. He has done so. Quite rightly, as you've said there, he's been turned down in 2020. And I think the most important thing in this case is that, listening to Mr. Bulger there talking on your sister programme, emotive, of course, and the views of the victims have to be looked at, have to be considered, and the parole board will do that. And I think criminal barristers up and down the country dealing with these cases, we're independent, judiciary are independent, the parole board is independent, and that's really the key part of this, I think.
Yeah, no, I think I get that, and I think most people do, but I think people do worry that they have made some curious decisions of late. Colin Pitchfork was another one, double murderer, who was released into a kind of open prison without anybody really knowing about it. And then as soon as he was granted parole, within 2 weeks, he was hauled back inside again because he was found loitering around a school where young women were attending. And you do wonder whether or not the parole board is doing it right, I suppose. I mean, you might tell me that these are, unusually rare cases and they tend to be high profile, and that may well be true. But it just seems to me that they ought to have a better way of dealing with individual cases and not treating them as if they're the same as everybody else, because there are some cases which surely deserve special treatment.
And I can see that point entirely. I think the parole board themselves have in recent years perhaps been accused of a lack of transparency. There's obviously got to be a side point to that of saying that these kind of hearings that are held in private, while obviously very emotive for the victims, there is also a public necessity to make sure that those perhaps giving evidence on behalf of the parole board, not necessarily Venables himself, but those prison staff, members of the parole service, that they have an element of security as well. But certainly, I think transparency throughout criminal justice is important. Justice has to be seen to be done. And I think there's certainly an argument to say that more transparency throughout this process would be necessary. But of course, as you say, in this case, it's probably one of the more, if not the most horrific, one of the more horrific cases that we all look back on and remember. But it's certainly a case where at the moment we have to let the parole board do their thing. In 2020, they refused, and they will look at all of the evidence. They will consider, as they should do, the victims. They will consider what everybody says, and they will make that decision. And it's certainly going to be the case that they will have to do that. And it's a heavy pressure that rests on them.
I know the family asked if they could witness the parole board hearing. They were turned down, as were the Times newspaper, who wanted to do it on the basis that it was, you know, something that transparency would benefit from, if you like. But, I mean, I think the reason given was that there shouldn't be anybody there because it might be detrimental to Jon Venables himself, which I think, again, a lot of people feel slightly weird about, especially considering the government have now just changed the law when it comes to people having to appear at their own sentencing hearings.
Yes, and that's, of course, something that we've certainly the criminal bar have discussed and that we've had our own views on, whether, again, the safety of dock officers, you know, those people that bring defendants to court, whether they are going to be entirely protected by this new plan the government has to drag people to court. But certainly in terms of the parole board, while you can see on the one hand how this circumstance would be such, and I've heard what the family say, that of course, you know, Venables will know where they are and what they're doing. But I think the obvious answer is that there has to be at this point, and while it leaves a bitter taste in the mouth, we do still have a duty of care. You know, the criminal justice system, criminal barristers represent defendants that have done horrible things. Judges sentence them, parole boards deal with them. There is certainly still an element where we have to protect those people. But also, as I say, the people in the parole board, perhaps those who are giving evidence on behalf of Venables, you know, there is that has to be taken into account. And of course, whether or not, given that the court made an order for his anonymity, whether that's right or wrong, the court did do that. He has been given that for life. There is obviously an argument about that, but the parole board are bound by that decision and do owe a duty and do have to protect that. And so while it obviously leaves a very bitter taste in the mouth, we do have to follow guidelines and procedures and principles. And as I say, it's important that is independent, and it's important. We see sometimes when the government steps in and makes these laws, it's those of us that work in the system that have to sort of clean up that mess. But we follow that procedure and that guideline, and that's where this case is.
James, thanks very much indeed. James Oliveira Agnew, their criminal barrister, on day 2 coming up of the James Bulger killer's parole hearing. And it may well be, and you can only hope, the parole board will turn him down for release. Penny says no adult who murders a child should be given parole. Also, no juvenile who commits murder should ever be released. If they could murder someone as a kid, then that evil belongs where it stays. It should never be set loose back on society. Steph says the same. No, never under any circumstance should a child murderer be given parole. And Jennifer says, I'd go so far as to say that anyone who murders anyone intentionally should not get parole. Very strong feelings, I think, for most people watching this show and following that story, because nobody could really understand how any sane individual could recommend that Jon Venables be given parole at this point in his life.